No warning, no discussion, just a cold letter threatening liens and foreclosure. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was a power move. They expected me to panic, to give in, to stay quiet like everyone else. But something about that fine felt wrong, like they were hiding a secret they never thought I'd uncover. So instead of paying, I started digging. Their rules, their paperwork, their legal process, and what I found changed everything and turned their own system against them. Stay till the end, because this HOA never saw my revenge coming. I still remember the exact moment everything started. It was a normal weekday afternoon. Nothing special. I had just gotten home from work, tired and ready to relax. I checked my mailbox like I always did, expecting nothing more than bills or advertisements. Instead, I found an official-looking envelope. It had the HOA's logo printed on the corner. Homeowners Association. At first, I didn't think much of it. The HOA had always been annoying, but usually harmless. They would send reminders about lawn height, trash bins, or holiday decorations. Nothing serious. But as soon as I opened the letter, my stomach dropped. The paper said, "Final notice, HOA fine, $10,000. Payment due within 14 days. I stared at the number. $10,000. I thought it had to be a mistake. I reread the letter. Then I read it again. And again. According to them, I had violated a community compliance rule related to exterior home modifications. They claimed I had made changes to my property without approval. Because of that, I was being charged a massive fine. But here's the problem. I hadn't changed anything. No new paint. No construction. No fence. Nothing. My house looked the same as it had for years. So I assumed it was a clerical error. Maybe they mixed up addresses. Maybe someone typed the wrong name. Still, seeing a $10,000 fine felt like being punched in the chest. I sat down at my kitchen table and read every word carefully. The letter wasn't friendly. It wasn't open for discussion. It wasn't asking questions. It was a demand. They warned that if I didn't pay within 14 days, they could add late fees, place a lien on my home, take legal action, start foreclosure, proceedings, foreclosure. That word stuck in my mind. I worked hard for this house. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't huge. But it was mine. The idea that a group of neighborhood board members could threaten my home over something I didn't even do made my blood boil. At first, I felt panic. I kept thinking, what if they're serious? What if they can actually do this? What if I lose my home? But panic slowly turned into anger, because this wasn't just a mistake. It felt like intimidation. Calling the HOA the next morning, I called the HOA office. After sitting on hold for almost 20 minutes, someone finally answered. I explained calmly that I had received a fine and believed it was an error. The woman on the phone sounded bored. She said, "The violation has already been documented. The fine stands." I asked what violation. She told me my house had an unauthorized exterior modification. I asked what modification. She paused, then said, "It's in the report." That was it. No explanation. No proof. No photos. No details. Just, it's in the report. I asked to speak to someone higher up. She transferred me to a voicemail. No callback. No email response. No clarification. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't trying to resolve this. They were trying to pressure me into paying. The fear sets in that week was one of the most stressful of my life. Every time I checked my mail, I expected another threatening letter. Every time my phone rang, my heart jumped. I started imagining worst-case scenarios. What if they added more fees? What if they ruined my credit? What if they actually put a lien on my home? I talked to friends and family. Some said, just pay it and move on. Others said, HOAs are powerful. You don't want to fight them. But something about that advice bothered me. Why should I pay $10,000 for something I didn't do? Why should I stay quiet just because they were bigger and louder? The more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. So instead of giving in to fear, I decided to understand exactly what they were accusing me of. Requesting evidence, I sent a formal email to the HOA. I asked for Proof of the violation photos inspection reports the exact rule. I had broken the date and time of the alleged violation days past. No response. I sent another email. Still nothing. Then finally, I received a short reply. Violation confirmed by board. Fine remains valid. No attachments. No proof. No explanation. That was the moment I stopped believing this was a misunderstanding. This felt like a power play. Digging into their rules, if they were going to use the rules against me, I decided I would read those rules myself. I downloaded the HOA bylaws. All of them. It was a long document. Dozens of pages. Legal language. Small print. At first, it felt overwhelming. But I kept reading. Page by page. Line by line. And the more I read, the more interesting things I noticed. There were clear procedures the HOA had to follow before issuing fines. They were required to send a written warning, give homeowners a chance to fix the issue, provide proof of the violation, allow a formal hearing if requested, vote on large fines in a board meeting, keep official records of decisions. But I had received no warning, no hearing, no proof, no meeting notice, no opportunity to defend myself. If the bylaws were accurate, then they hadn't followed their own rules. That discovery changed everything. Instead of feeling scared, I started feeling determined. If they wanted to enforce the rules, they needed to follow them too. The suspicion grows the deeper I looked, the more suspicious the situation became. I started talking to neighbors. Quietly, casually, I asked if anyone else had received large fines recently. A few people hesitated. Then one neighbor admitted something shocking. They had been fined thousands of dollars over a minor issue, something trivial. When they tried to fight it, the HOA threatened legal action. They eventually paid because they were scared. Another neighbor said they felt targeted after disagreeing with the board at a meeting. A pattern was starting to form. This wasn't just about me. This HOA board might have been abusing its power. A decision is made by the end of that week. I had made a choice. I wasn't going to pay the fine. I wasn't going to panic. And I wasn't going to stay quiet. If the HOA wanted to fight, they were going to get one, but legally, carefully, and by their own rules. I started organizing everything. The fine notice, my emails, their replies, the HOA bylaws, notes about timeline statements from neighbors. I treated it like a case because it was becoming one. And deep down, I felt something new replacing my fear. Confidence. They thought I would give up. They thought I would pay. They had no idea I was just getting started. After deciding not to pay the fine, my fear slowly turned into focus. I realized something important. If I wanted to fight this, I had to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. So I treated the situation like an investigation. Every night after work, I sat at my dining table with a notebook, my laptop, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. I highlighted rules. I wrote notes. I marked timelines. At first, it felt overwhelming. But soon, a clear picture started to form, and it didn't look good for the HOA. Looking closely at their process, the bylaws explained exactly how violations were supposed to be handled. Before any large fine could be issued, the HOA was required to send a written warning, explaining the violation, give a homeowner time to fix the issue, provide clear evidence, including photos, offer hearing if the homeowner requested one, record the decision. In official board meeting minutes, vote formally on fines above a certain amount, but none of this had happened in my case. I never received a warning. I never received proof. I was never offered a hearing. I was never notified of a vote. Instead, I got a sudden demand for $10,000. That alone felt suspicious. But I wanted more than a feeling. I wanted proof. Requesting official records, I sent a formal written request to the HOA asking for meeting minutes where my fine was approved, evidence of a vote, inspection records, any complaints related to my property this time. I made my request more official. I referenced specific bylaw sections. I set a clear deadline. I kept copies of everything. Days passed. Then I received a response. It was short. They said they were reviewing my request. Another week passed. Finally, they sent partial records. And what I saw shocked me. The missing vote, according to the documents, there was no official vote approving my $10,000 fine. No board meeting discussion. No record of approval. No formal decision. The fine appeared in their system as if it had been created informally, almost like someone had decided it on their own. That raised a serious red flag. Because if a single board member had issued this fine without approval, it wasn't just unfair. It could be illegal. Talking to more neighbors at this point, I realized I couldn't fight this alone. So I started talking to more homeowners. Not loudly, not dramatically, just calmly and privately. I asked simple questions. Have you ever had trouble with the HOA? Have you received large fines? Did they follow proper process with you? What I heard made my stomach sink. One neighbor told me they had been fined $3,500 for leaving trash bins visible overnight. Another said they were charged $5,000 over a fence color dispute. Someone else had paid thousands to avoid legal threats. But the most disturbing part? Many of them said the HOA never gave them proper hearings either. Some admitted they felt bullied. Some said they paid because they were scared. Some said they wanted to fight back but felt powerless. Slowly, a pattern became clear. This HOA wasn't just strict. They were abusing power. Realizing I was being targeted, then I remembered something. A few months earlier, I had spoken up at an HOA meeting. The board had proposed increasing monthly fees. I had questioned where the money was going. I wasn't rude. I wasn't aggressive. But I challenged them publicly. And now, months later, I was suddenly hit with a massive fine. That timing didn't feel random anymore. It felt personal. It felt like retaliation. Gathering statements, I asked some neighbors if they would be willing to share their experiences in writing. Not everyone agreed. Some were afraid. Some didn't want trouble. But a few brave homeowners agreed to help. They wrote statements about being fined without proper warning, being denied fair hearings, feeling intimidated by board members paying fines out of fear. I kept everything organized. Each story added weight to my case. This was no longer just about me. This was about a system being misused. My stress and my motivation, I won't pretend this was easy. Some nights, I couldn't sleep. I worried. What if they retaliate further? What if they raise the fine? What if they actually try to take my home? I felt pressure. I felt anxiety. I felt anger. But I also felt something stronger, a sense of responsibility. If I gave in, they would keep doing this to others. If I fought back, I might not only protect myself, I might stop the abuse. That thought kept me going. Consulting a lawyer eventually, I realized I needed legal advice. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. I brought everything. The fine notice, HOA bylaws, email records, missing vote evidence, neighbor statements. He reviewed the documents carefully. Then he leaned back and said something I'll never forget. This HOA did not follow their own legal process. You have a strong case. He explained that the fine could be challenged. The HOA might be violating state law. Their failure to follow procedure could void the penalty if they acted in bad faith. They could be liable for damages the first time. I felt real hope, not emotional hope, legal hope. Filing a formal dispute with his guidance, I submitted a formal legal dispute to the HOA. The letter demanded immediate suspension of the fine, full disclosure of board records, a formal hearing proof of compliance with bylaws. We cited specific legal sections. We warned them that failure to comply could lead to legal action. This time, they couldn't ignore me. The HOA's tone changes a week later. I receive a response. But the tone was different. No longer cold. No longer dismissive. Now it sounded defensive. They claimed the fine was valid. But they also said they were reviewing the matter. That told me something important. They were nervous. They knew they were vulnerable. A quiet discovery while reviewing more documents. I noticed something disturbing. One board member's name kept appearing on controversial decisions. Fines, penalties, complaints. He seemed to be the one pushing most of them. So I looked him up, and what I found was unsettling. He had a personal history of conflicts with homeowners. He had business interests that benefited from certain HOA enforcement actions. He had influence over contractors hired by the HOA. It began to feel like a conflict of interest, maybe even corruption. A turning point by the end of this phase, I realized something powerful. This was no longer just about a $10,000 fine. This was about Abuse of authority, retaliation, lack of transparency, potential corruption, homeowners being intimidated into silence. And suddenly, I wasn't just defending myself. I was challenging a broken system. The calm before the storm, the HOA scheduled a formal hearing. They thought this would end quietly. They thought they could control the situation. But I had evidence. I had witnesses. I had legal support. And I was no longer scared. I was ready. Because in the next phase, I would confront them face to face and force them to explain what they had done. The day of the HOA hearing arrived faster than I expected. For weeks, I had been preparing, collecting documents, highlighting rules, organizing evidence, talking to neighbors, working with my lawyer. But when the actual day came, I still felt a knot in my stomach. It's one thing to prepare in private. It's another thing to walk into a room where people in power are sitting across from you. People who had already shown they didn't care about fairness. Walking into the meeting took place in a small community room near the clubhouse. It didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a normal HOA meeting space. Folding chairs, a long table, a few framed photos of a neighborhood on the walls. But the atmosphere felt heavy. The HOA board members sat on one side of the table. 5 of them, including the board member I suspected was behind my fine. He avoided eye contact when I walked in. That alone told me a lot. My lawyer sat beside me. I felt more confident knowing I wasn't alone. Still, I could feel the tension in my chest. How they started the hearing, the HOA president opened the meeting with a formal tone. She explained that this was a hearing to discuss my alleged violation and the $10,000 fine. Then she turned to me and said, "You may explain why you believe the fine is invalid." Her tone sounded polite, but not warm. More like she expected this to be quick and controlled. They probably assumed I would apologize, or beg, or panic. Instead, I opened my folder and calmly began. Presenting my side, I spoke slowly, clearly, without raising my voice. I explained. I never received a written warning. I never received proof of a violation. I was never offered a hearing before the fine. I never saw evidence of a board vote approving it. Then I held up the HOA bylaws, and I read specific sections out loud. The exact rules they were required to follow. Rules they had ignored. The room grew quiet. Some board members shifted in their chairs, asking them for evidence. Then I asked a simple question. "Can you show me the proof of the violation?" There was a pause. One board member shuffled papers. Another whispered something quietly. Finally, the same board member I distrusted spoke up. He said they had documentation. But when I asked to see it, they produced only a few blurry photos that didn't clearly show any violation. The photos didn't even prove the claim. It looked weak, and everyone in the room knew it. Exposing the missing vote, then my lawyer stepped in. He asked for proof that the board had formally voted to issue the $10,000 fine. Silence. They flipped through papers, checked folders, whispered to each other. Finally, the HOA president admitted, "We do not currently have those records available." That was a huge moment, because without a formal vote, the fine had no legal foundation, and they knew it. Revealing the pattern, then I presented something they weren't expecting. Statements from other homeowners, neighbors who had been fined, neighbors who felt bullied, neighbors who were afraid to speak publicly. I didn't name anyone out loud, but I showed enough to demonstrate a pattern of excessive fines, lack of hearings, threats of legal action, pressure. To pay quickly, I explained calmly. This doesn't feel like enforcement. It feels like intimidation. That sentence hung in the air. The board member's reaction when the attention turned toward the board member I suspected, he became defensive. He claimed he was just enforcing rules. But when my lawyer questioned him more closely, his answers started sounding inconsistent. He struggled to explain why my fine was issued so suddenly, why proper steps weren't followed, why documentation was incomplete at one point. He raised his voice. That emotional reaction didn't help his case. It made him look guilty. My emotional moment, then I spoke again, not as a legal argument, but as a homeowner. I said, "I work hard to keep my home. I respect the neighborhood. But being threatened with foreclosure over something I didn't do felt terrifying. It felt unfair. It felt like abuse of power." My voice shook slightly, but I didn't stop. I'm not here to fight the HOA. I'm here to stop this from happening again, to me or to anyone else. For a moment, the room felt still. I saw something change in a few faces. The board's internal conflict. The board asked for a short private discussion. They stepped into another room. I sat quietly with my lawyer. My heart raced. I didn't know what they would decide. Part of me feared retaliation. Another part of me felt confident we had exposed too much for them to ignore. After several minutes, they returned. Their decision, the HOA president cleared her throat. She announced, the $10,000 fine would be temporarily suspended. They would conduct an internal review. They would reevaluate their enforcement procedures. A final decision will be made after further investigation. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was a turning point. The fine was no longer active. The threat to my home was paused. And for the first time, the HOA was on the defensive. What happened after the hearing in the weeks that followed? Something strange happened. The HOA's behavior changed. They stopped sending aggressive letters. They became quieter, more cautious. Then rumors started spreading. Neighbors told me the board was arguing internally. Some board members were unhappy with how fines had been handled. There were talks of audits, talks of leadership changes. It felt like pressure was building behind scenes. A private message one evening. I received a private message from another homeowner. They thanked me. They said they had been fined unfairly months earlier and felt powerless to fight it. But now they felt encouraged. That message meant more to me than any legal win, because it reminded me why I started this. A quiet warning, not everything was positive, though. A few days later, I noticed the same board member watching me during a community event. He didn't say anything, but his expression looked tense, almost resentful. I realized something important. This wasn't over. He wouldn't let this go easily. Preparing for the next step, my lawyer warned me that the HOA might try to justify their actions, they might attempt a settlement, or they might escalate the conflict. So we stayed ready. We continued gathering documents, tracking emails, saving every communication. Because if this turned into a legal battle, we wanted to be prepared. A shift in power before all this started. I felt like a powerless homeowner facing a powerful organization. But now, the dynamic had changed. They were no longer confident. They were cautious. And I realized something empowering. They weren't as untouchable as they wanted people to believe. The calm before the legal storm, the HOA announced they would release their final decision soon. But behind the scenes, I suspected something bigger was coming. Because if their internal review exposed wrongdoing, it wouldn't just affect my fine. It could affect the entire board. It could turn into a lawsuit. It could expose everything. And deep down, I knew the real confrontation hadn't even started yet. For a few weeks after the hearing, things went quiet, too quiet. The HOA stopped sending aggressive letters. No new fines, no threats, no updates. At first, I thought it meant they were backing down. But deep inside, I knew silence from people like this usually meant they were planning their next move. And I was right. The letter that changed everything one morning. I received another envelope from the HOA's legal office. My heart tightened when I saw it. I opened it carefully, expecting another threat. But this time, it wasn't demand for payment. It was something else. A legal notice. They claimed they were conducting an internal review, but they also insisted their fine was still enforceable until proven otherwise. They were trying to keep pressure on me, not because they were confident, but because they didn't want to look weak. That letter made one thing clear. They weren't going to admit wrongdoing easily. My lawyer's advice, I met with my lawyer again. He reviewed the new letter and shook his head. He said calmly, they're trying to intimidate you into backing off, but their case is weak. You actually have a strong opportunity here. Then he suggested something I hadn't fully considered. Instead of just defending myself, we could go on the offensive, not with emotion, not with revenge, but with law. Turning defense into action, my lawyer explained that we could file a lawsuit against the HOA for issuing an invalid fine, violating their own bylaws, acting in bad faith, emotional distress, abuse of authority, failure to follow due process. He said something that stuck with me. Not just protecting yourself anymore. You're holding them accountable. That sentence changed how I saw everything. This was no longer just survival. This was about justice. The decision to sue, I won't lie. Filing a lawsuit felt intimidating. HOAs have lawyers, money, influence, and I was just one homeowner. I asked myself hard questions. What if this drags on for years? What if it costs too much? What if they retaliate again? But then I remembered the fear I felt opening that $10,000 fine, the neighbors who were too scared to fight, the board member who abused his power, the pattern of intimidation. And I knew if I stayed silent, they would keep doing this. So I said yes. We filed a lawsuit. How the HOA reacted once they were officially served, their attitude shifted again. Suddenly, they weren't quiet anymore. They sent formal legal responses. They denied wrongdoing. They claimed they followed proper procedures. But their defense had holes. Big ones. Because we had evidence. And they knew it. The discovery process, the legal discovery phase began. This meant both sides had to share documents. Emails, meeting notes, internal communications, records of fines, board messages. This was where things got interesting, because once we started reviewing their internal emails, a clearer picture emerged, and it wasn't pretty. The emails they never expected me to see among the documents. We found internal HOA emails, messages between board members, messages discussing fines, messages discussing homeowners. And in those emails, we saw the truth. One board member, the same one I suspected, was actively pushing for aggressive fines. He described certain homeowners as troublemakers, difficult, people who need to be taught a lesson, and in one email he mentioned me by name. He wrote that I had been too vocal at previous meetings. That email felt like a punch to the chest, because it confirmed what I had suspected. This wasn't just about a rule. It was personal. Proof of retaliation, even worse. We found messages suggesting that my fine was meant to set an example. Not because I violated anything, but because I challenged them. That alone strengthened our case dramatically. It showed retaliation, bias, abuse of power, bad faith enforcement. This was no longer just procedural misconduct. It was targeted. Expanding the case once we saw that evidence, my lawyer suggested expanding the lawsuit, not only challenging my fine, but also questioning the HOA's broader practices. We included evidence of other unfair fine statements from neighbors' records showing lack of proper hearings, patterns of intimidation. The case was getting bigger, and the HOA knew it. Their attempt to settle quietly a few weeks later, the HOA's lawyers reached out. They suggested a private settlement. They offered to cancel my fine, pay some legal costs, keep everything confidential at first. It sounded tempting, but there was one condition: silence. They didn't want this exposed. And that bothered me, because this wasn't just about money. It was about stopping the abuse. So I declined. Emotional pressure builds as the lawsuit continued. The emotional weight increased. Some days I felt confident. Other days I felt exhausted. Legal paperwork piled up. Deadlines kept coming. The stress sometimes felt heavy. There were moments I wondered if it would have been easier to just pay the fine and walk away. But then I'd think about how wrong that would feel. And I kept going. The HOA starts cracking behind the scenes. Pressure was building inside the HOA. Board members began blaming each other. Some distanced themselves from controversial decisions. Rumors spread that leadership might change. Homeowners started asking questions. Why were fines so high? Why weren't procedures followed? Why was the board being sued? The HOA's image was cracking. Media interest. At one point, a local journalist reached out. They had heard about the lawsuit. They wanted to know if I was willing to share my story. I hesitated. Public attention can help, but it can also complicate things. After discussing with my lawyer, I agreed to share a limited statement. Not emotional, not dramatic, just factual. And once the story quietly circulated, the HOA felt even more pressure. My personal growth, this process changed me. Before all this, I avoided conflict. I stayed quiet. I didn't like confrontation, but this experience forced me to speak up, to stand my ground, to defend myself, to challenge authority when it's wrong. It wasn't about being aggressive. It was about being firm, and I felt stronger because of it. The board member under fire as the case progressed. The board member who pushed my fine came under heavy scrutiny. His emails, his decisions, his conflicts of interest. Other board members started distancing themselves from him. Homeowners questioned his leadership, and slowly, he started losing influence. That shift felt symbolic. Power was moving, preparing for court eventually. The lawsuit approached a critical stage. If no settlement was reached, it could go to court. My lawyer prepared arguments, organized evidence, prepared witness lists. I practiced what I might say if I had to testify, not in an emotional way, but calmly, truthfully, because the facts were on our side. The night before the turning point, the night before a major legal meeting, I sat alone in my living room, thinking about how far this had come. It started with one letter, one unfair fine, one moment of fear, and now it had become a legal challenge against an entire HOA board. I felt nervous, but I also felt proud, because I hadn't backed down. A feeling that something big was coming. My lawyer hinted that the HOA might soon make a serious move, either a full settlement of public admission or a courtroom fight. Something had to give, because their position was getting weaker, and they knew it. The calm before the verdict. By the end of this phase, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something big, a resolution, a win, or a public showdown. And I knew the next part of this story would determine everything. By the time our case moved closer to court, it no longer felt like just my personal battle. It felt like a public test of power. The HOA had lawyers, money, influence, a polished image. But what they didn't have anymore was control of the truth. Walking into the legal arena, the first major legal hearing felt intimidating. I wasn't used to courtrooms, or legal language, or being part of something this serious. But as I sat beside my lawyer, watching the HOA's legal team across the room, I noticed something surprising. They didn't look confident. They looked tense. They knew their emails, records, and decisions were now part of the legal record. They couldn't hide anymore. The HOA strategy begins to crack at first. The HOA's lawyers tried to frame the case as a simple disagreement. They claimed the fine was reasonable, the board acted in good faith, any mistakes were minor technical errors. But my lawyer calmly presented evidence that told a very different story. Emails showing retaliation, proof of missing votes, lack of proper notice, statements from other homeowners, internal discussions revealing bias. Piece by piece, their minor technical errors started looking like a pattern of misconduct. When my name appeared in their emails, one of the strongest moments was when my lawyer presented the internal email that mentioned me by name. The email said I was too vocal and needed to be handled carefully. Seeing that displayed in court was surreal. It proved something I had felt from the beginning. This wasn't about a rule. It was about silencing someone who challenged them. And that didn't sit well with the judge. The judge's reaction, the judge listened carefully. He asked sharp questions. He didn't seem impressed by the HOA's excuses. At one point, he asked, "Can you explain why no formal vote exists for a $10,000 fine?" The HOA's lawyer hesitated. There wasn't a good answer, because there wasn't one. That silence felt louder than any argument. My turn to speak eventually. I was asked to speak, not as a lawyer, not as an expert, just as a homeowner. I stood up, hands slightly shaking, but voice steady. I explained how receiving a fine felt the fear of losing my home, the stress of being threatened, the feeling of being targeted, the effort it took to fight back. I said, I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just wanted fairness. But instead of fairness, I was met with threats. The courtroom stayed quiet. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't dramatize. I just told the truth. The HOA board member under pressure. Then the board member who had pushed my fine was questioned. Watching him answer under oath was revealing. He tried to justify his decisions, but when confronted with his own emails, his tone shifted. He looked uncomfortable, defensive, cornered. He struggled to explain why I was singled out, and that made a difference. A pattern becomes official. One of the biggest moments was when the judge acknowledged a pattern of enforcement, not random mistakes, not isolated incidents. A repeated behavior that unfairly targeted certain homeowners. That acknowledgement gave our case serious weight. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. The HOA's reputation starts to collapse as legal updates became public. More homeowners started paying attention. People began asking questions. Why were fines so high? Why weren't hearings fair? Who was really making decisions? Attendance at HOA meetings increased. Some residents demanded leadership changes. The HOA's authority was weakening in real time. The emotional weight of the moment, there were nights I barely slept. Not because I regretted fighting, but because the pressure felt heavy. Court dates, legal documents, public attention. Sometimes I felt drained. But every time I considered giving up, I remembered how scared I felt when that fine first arrived. And I knew I couldn't walk away now. The turning point. The judge's statement during one critical session. The judge made a comment that felt like a turning point. He said the HOA's process appeared deeply flawed and possibly abusive. Hearing that from a judge felt like validation. Not emotional validation. Legal validation. The truth was being recognized. The HOA attempts one last settlement not long after that session. The HOA made another settlement offer. This one was much bigger. They offered to cancel the fine permanently, pay all my legal fees, compensate me, financially promise internal reforms. But again, they wanted confidentiality. They wanted silence. They wanted this buried. And again, I refused, because this story didn't deserve to be buried. Support from neighbors grows. More neighbors began reaching out. Some thanked me. Some apologized for staying silent earlier. Some shared their own experiences. One message stood out. A homeowner wrote, "If you hadn't fought this, I would have kept believing I had no rights." That message meant everything. The final court hearing arrives eventually. The case reached a final major hearing. This would shape the outcome. My lawyer prepared closing arguments. We organized every key point. Illegal fine, retaliation pattern of abuse, emotional impact, HOA's failure to follow its own rules. The HOA's legal team prepared too, but their position was weaker now. Sitting in silence before the decision on the day of the final hearing, I sat quietly in the courtroom, thinking about the day I opened that letter. The nights I felt afraid, the neighbors who were scared, the months of stress, the strength I had built no matter what happened. I knew I had stood up for myself, and that mattered. The judge reviews the evidence. The judge reviewed everything carefully. Emails, records, testimony, bylaws, statements. This wasn't rushed. It felt thorough, fair, the kind of fairness I wish the HOA had shown from the beginning. Waiting for the outcome after closing arguments, the judge said he would issue a ruling soon. That waiting period felt endless. Every phone notification made my heart jump. Every email felt like it might carry news. But beneath the anxiety, I felt calm, because the truth was finally out in the open. The feeling that justice was close by the end of the stage, I felt something powerful. No matter the final decision, the HOA had already lost something important. Their fear tactics, their unchecked authority, their ability to silence people. They had been exposed. And deep down, I sensed the final ruling was going to change everything. The day the verdict was delivered felt surreal. I woke up early, my stomach full of butterflies. It was like waiting for a storm that would either pass peacefully or hit with full force. Months of stress, anxiety, and preparation had led to this moment. I arrived at the courthouse with my lawyer. The courtroom was quiet. I could feel the tension in the air, even though it looked ordinary. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Then he sat, and the room went silent again. The judge speaks. The judge began summarizing the case. He outlined how the HOA issued the $10,000 fine. He went over the violations they were supposed to follow, the proper procedures, the lack of warnings, and the missing board vote. He discussed the evidence we had submitted. Emails showing retaliation, internal communications targeting me personally, statements from other homeowners, missing or incomplete records, flawed enforcement patterns. The judge paused several times, as if weighing every word. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the edge of the chair, barely daring to breathe. Then he looked at the HOA's representatives. He said in a calm but firm tone, "The court finds that the HOA failed to follow its own rules. The fine issued to my name is hereby null and void." I felt my stomach drop in the best way possible. Relief, triumph, validation, total victory. But he wasn't done. Furthermore, he continued, the HOA is ordered to pay all legal fees incurred by my name and is fined for acting in bad faith and for intimidation tactics against homeowners. That meant The $10,000 fine was completely cancel my attorney's fees, would be covered by the HOA. The HOA had a financial penalty for its actions. I blinked. My lawyer smiled. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The board members sat frozen. They weren't expecting this outcome. Their confident, intimidating facade had crumbled completely. The emotional release after the judge left. I stepped outside the courtroom. I could feel the sun on my face, warm and real, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Months of fear, stress, sleepless nights, and emotional strain had finally culminated in justice. Not revenge in the petty sense, but legal justice that felt far more powerful. I thought about the first day I received that letter. I remembered the panic, the disbelief, the anger, and now, looking back, it all seemed like the first step in a journey I never expected to take. I felt proud, not arrogant, just proud that I hadn't given up, that I had stood up, that I had defended my home and my rights. The HOA's fallout news of the ruling traveled fast. A few neighbors reached out immediately, expressing relief and gratitude. Some admitted that they had been bullied or fined unfairly in the past, and seeing me one gave them hope. Within days, the HOA's internal politics began to unravel. Board members who had supported the aggressive enforcement practices were quietly stepping down. Leadership meetings became tense and guarded. Some homeowners even pushed for a complete audit of all fines issued in the last few years. The HOA's reputation in the community suffered. Where they had once ruled with intimidation, now they had to operate with caution and transparency. Their authority was no longer absolute. How neighbors reacted. One neighbor approached me weeks later. She had been fined over a small fence dispute and had quietly paid because she was afraid of losing her home. She told me she was finally going to challenge the HOA if anything similar happened again. Another neighbor said, "I was too scared to fight, but seeing you do it, I feel like I can stand up too." Messages and emails kept coming. People who had never spoken to me before thanked me. It wasn't about money. It was about restoring a sense of fairness and giving the powerless a voice. Personal reflection, winning this case changed me in ways I didn't expect. Before all this, I avoided confrontation. I stayed quiet. I didn't like to rock the boat. But now I had experienced the power of standing up for what is right. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through persistence, research, and lawful action. I learned that fear can be paralyzing, but knowledge and preparation can turn fear into strength, and that even when systems seem designed to favor the powerful, fairness and law can prevail if you refuse to stay silent. Lessons learned. There are lessons in this story I want to remember and share. Always know your rights. I wouldn't have won if I hadn't read the bylaws and understood the rules. Keep records. Emails, letters, and notes became my evidence. Without them, I might have been powerless. Legal support matters. A good lawyer can transform a hopeless fight into a strong case. Persistence is key. The HOA assumed I would give up. I didn't. That made all the difference. Justice can be satisfied without revenge. I didn't retaliate personally. I let the law do the work, and the results were even sweeter. The power shift after the lawsuit. The HOA had no choice but to change some of its practices. They became more cautious about issuing fines. They had to follow proper procedures strictly. Board members who had previously acted without accountability suddenly had limits. They couldn't intimidate homeowners anymore. They couldn't target someone personally without risking legal consequences. And that power shift felt like the most satisfying part. I didn't just win for myself. I had created an environment where others could finally feel safer in their own homes. Closing thoughts looking back, the $10,000 fine that seemed like the worst thing in the world was a catalyst for something bigger. It was terrifying, stressful, emotionally draining, but it forced me to take action, to research, to fight, to challenge the status quo. It forced me to grow, and in the end, I didn't just stop the unfair fine. I exposed the weaknesses in the system, held the board accountable, and restored justice, legally and transparently. It's been months since the final judgment, and the HOA is still recovering from the fallout. Board members are more careful, homeowners are more empowered, and the rules are finally being followed. And me? I feel stronger, wiser, and unshakably confident that standing up for what's right is always worth it.